Welcome to another deep dive. This time, we're heading to India, more specifically Chennai, to explore the fascinating world of public facilities and, their impact on daily life.
We'll be focusing on a resource that we often take for granted, water.
Right, just to turn on the tap and it's there, but for a lot of
Mm,
people in Chennai, it's not that simple.
Exactly. And what we'll find is that the story of public facilities like water is really a story about human rights, societal well-being, and so much more.
Okay, so let's start with the basics. What exactly are we talking about when we say public facilities?
It's a broad term for sure, but at its core, we're talking about the shared resources that should be available to everyone in a society,
Yes.
regardless of their income or social status.
So things like schools, hospitals, parks, roads, electricity, and of course, water supply and sanitation.
Precisely those things that are essential for a good quality of life.
And typically provided by the government, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you don't see private companies rushing to build sanitation systems in low-income neighborhoods.
You're exactly right. There's an economic rationale behind it. Private companies are driven by profit, and some essential services just don't offer the kind of financial returns that attract private investment.
But wouldn't something like water be different? I mean, there's always a demand for water, isn't there?
Well, sure, there's demand, but remember, a private company's goal is to make money. If they took over the water supply, they'd have to charge for it, and that could price out a huge portion of the population who simply can't afford it.
So you end up with this two-tiered system where the wealthy have access and the poor are left behind.
Precisely, it undermines the whole concept of these services being fundamental rights available to all citizens. So while private companies might have a role to play, the primary responsibility for public facilities usually falls on the government.
Which makes sense, but how do they pay for all of this?
Well, taxes are a major source of funding for public services. And in the case of something like water, there are also water charges.
Oh, so it's not just coming from general tax revenue. They actually charge people for the water they use.
Yes, but setting those charges is a delicate balancing act. They need to generate enough revenue to cover the costs of pumping, treating, and distributing the water, while also ensuring that it remains affordable for everyone.
It's like this constant tension between making this system financially viable and ensuring that everyone have access to this basic necessity.
Exactly, and that's where the concept of water as a fundamental right comes into play.
Right, because if it's a right, it can't just be about who can afford it.
You got it. And in India, water is considered a fundamental right. Article 21 of the Indian Constitution actually links water to the right to life.
So are you saying that denying someone access to water could be seen as a violation of their right to life?
Potentially, yes. And this isn't just a theoretical concept. There have been cases where courts have intervened to ensure water access.
Really, like what?
Well, in one instance, a court ordered a district to provide clean water to a community because their supply had been contaminated by a textile company.
Wow. So the right to water actually has some legal weight behind it. It's not just a feel-good statement.
Exactly, and that brings us to the case of Chennai, which offers a fascinating look at the challenges of providing public facilities in India.
And I hear we have some really compelling accounts of how people in Chennai are actually experiencing this.
Absolutely. We'll hear from people from all walks of life to see how the reality on the ground often differs drastically from the ideal of universal access.
All right, so before we jump into those personal stories, let's just do a quick recap. Can you give us a nice, concise definition of public facilities?
Sure. Public facilities are essentially those shared resources, things like schools, hospitals, transportation, and of course water systems that are considered essential for a good quality of life. And due to their connection to basic human rights and the challenges of private profitability, these services are typically provided by the government.
Perfect. So we've got a good foundation to build on. I'm really curious to hear those personal stories from Chennai and see how they illustrate these challenges.
Let's dive in. We'll hear from people with very different experiences and see what those experiences reveal. So, you're probably wondering what this actually looks like in practice.
Yeah.
Well, we've got these accounts from Chennai residents that really bring this issue to life.
Yeah, paint us a picture. What are we seeing here?
Okay, picture this, a high-ranking government official living in, a nice affluent area like Ananagar. His water supply runs dry, no big deal. He can easily afford to have a private tanker deliver water right to his home.
So for him, it's just a minor inconvenience.
Right now, picture a domestic worker living in a crowded area like Saidapet. She shares a single tap with 30 other families, and that tap only runs for 20 minutes, twice a day.
Wow. So it's not just about the amount of water, it's about the time and the effort it takes to get it.
Exactly. And for many, buying water isn't even an option. Like imagine someone in Mylapore where the groundwater is brackish. He can maybe get water from a private bore well for, washing and cleaning, but for drinking water, he's stuck with expensive bottled water or those purification systems.
So you have this situation where access to water is directly tied to your income and where you live.
And it really highlights the human impact of unequal access. It's not just some abstract policy debate. It's about people's daily struggles and the choices they have to make just to meet their basic needs.
It makes you realize that something as simple as turning on the tap is actually a privilege.
And this situation leads a lot of people to wonder, could private companies step in and solve these water problems?
Yeah, I mean, if the government's struggling to provide access, could the private sector be the answer?
It's not that straightforward. While private companies are often praised for their, efficiency and innovation, there's some important things to consider when we're talking about something as essential as water.
Okay, so what are some of the potential downsides of letting private companies manage the water supply?
Well, first, if we look at the global landscape, water supply is overwhelmingly a government function. It's quite rare to see private companies playing a dominant role.
That is interesting. Why would that be? I mean, wouldn't they be eager to tap into a market with such high demand?
Well, there are a few reasons. Firstly, almost everywhere, water is seen as a public good, an essential resource, and so there are ethical and social concerns about handing over control to companies whose main goal is profit.
So it's not just about efficiency, it's about who should be in charge of such a vital resource.
Right. And then there's the issue of affordability. We've seen in some parts of the world that when water is privatized, prices go up, sometimes dramatically, making it unaffordable for many, especially the poor.
I think I've even heard of protests and riots in some countries because people couldn't afford water after it was privatized.
Exactly. It highlights the potential for social unrest when you turn a basic need like water into a commodity governed by market forces.
So it's definitely not a guaranteed win. What about India specifically? Have there been instances where private companies have successfully managed water?
It's a mixed bag. In some cities, private companies have been brought in to handle certain aspects of water management, like transportation or distribution.
Like in Chennai, where they use those private water tankers to supplement the municipal supply.
Right. But even in these cases, the government usually keeps control over pricing and regulation. It's more of a partnership than a complete handover.
So it's not a black and white issue. It really depends on the context.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that there are also examples of government-run water systems that are both efficient and fair.
Like Porto Alegre in Brazil, right? Where they've achieved universal access to safe water and seen big improvements in public health.
Yes, and closer to home, Mumbai's water department is considered quite efficient. They've implemented systems to reduce water loss, and they've improved revenue collection, making the system more financially sustainable.
So it's not like government-run systems are inherently flawed. They can work if they're managed well.
Absolutely. And let's not forget about citizen participation. Porto Alegre is a prime example of how involving the public in decision-making can lead to a more responsive and equitable water system.
It makes you wonder if a similar approach could work in Chennai, bringing residents into the conversation about how water is managed.
It's definitely worth exploring. Engaging residents, being more transparent about how the water department operates, and holding them accountable could make a significant difference.
It's not just about who's in charge, it's about designing a system that works for everyone.
Absolutely. And that brings us to another important question. What about reducing demand? Could conservation help address some of these water challenges?
Right, we've been focusing on supply, but what about using water more efficiently in the first place?
Exactly. And it's not just about individual actions like fixing leaks or using those water-saving appliances. There's a lot that can be done at the city level as well.
You're talking about investing in infrastructure that reduces water loss, things like rainwater harvesting systems, or promoting water-wise landscaping.
Exactly. And it goes beyond just water. Think about saving electricity, cutting down on our use of private vehicles, and investing in good public transportation.
Like Mumbai's train system, the one that carries millions of people every day.
That's the one. It's a great example of how public transport can reduce traffic and pollution. Imagine the impact if Chennai had a similar system.
It seems like it all comes back to this idea that everything's connected. Water, electricity, transportation, it's all part of the same puzzle.
You hit the nail on the head. Sustainable solutions require us to think holistically to see how these different systems interact.
So we can't just focus on increasing the water supply.
Yeah.
We need to think about how we use water, how we use energy, how we get around the city.
Exactly. And it's not just about technology and infrastructure. It's about changing our mindsets, how much we consume what we expect.
So before we get into that, can we just do a quick recap? Can you give us a quick summary of the pros and cons of private companies managing water supply?
Sure. So while private companies are often seen as a way to fix inefficiencies in water management, there are some things to keep in mind globally. Water supply is mostly a government function because of ethical concerns, and the need to make sure everyone has access privatization can lead to higher prices and sometimes even social unrest if affordability is not addressed. While private companies can be good partners in some situations, successful government-run systems show that public management can be both efficient and fair.
That's helpful.
Yeah.
Now, I'm really intrigued by this idea of a more holistic approach. How can we connect these different parts of city life to create a more sustainable future?
Let's explore that next. We'll delve into how water, electricity, and transportation are all linked, and how changing our mindsets and consumption patterns can lead to a more sustainable and equitable Chennai.
Okay, so we've talked about water, but you also mentioned things like transportation and electricity. How do those fit into creating a more sustainable Chennai?
Well, it all comes down to understanding, how these different urban systems are connected. Like, for example, think about how much electricity is needed to, pump and treat the water. If we can reduce our overall electricity consumption, that takes some of the pressure off the power grid and frees up resources that could be used to, improve the water system.
So it's kind of like a domino effect. Saving electricity in one area can have these positive impacts on something else that you might not think is related.
Exactly. And the same logic applies to transportation. The more we rely on private cars, the worse the traffic gets, the more fuel we burn, and the more pollution we create. And that pollution can actually affect water quality. And of course, all that traffic makes it harder to transport water efficiently.
So if we had, a good, affordable public transportation system, we could reduce traffic pollution and actually indirectly improve the water situation as well.
That's the idea. And a well-functioning public transport system also makes it easier for people to access jobs, education, healthcare, all those things that contribute to a better quality of life. It's about creating a city that's more connected and more equitable.
Like weaving a more sustainable fabric for the entire city.
That's a great way to put it. And speaking of essential services, there's one we haven't mentioned yet: sanitation. It's every bit as vital as clean water when it comes to public health.
Yeah, we can't talk about water without talking about waste. And I'm guessing that access to proper sanitation is also a major challenge in India.
Unfortunately, you're right. While access to drinking water has improved a lot in recent years, sanitation facilities are still lagging behind. Official figures from 2011 showed that only around 53% of households in India had access to sanitation facilities within their homes.
And I imagine, like with water, it's the poor who suffer the most from this lack of access.
Sadly, yes. Inadequate sanitation impacts everything: health, hygiene, overall quality of life. It can lead to the spread of diseases. It can contaminate water sources and create these really unsafe and unsanitary living conditions.
It's a reminder that even in a rapidly developing country like India, there are still these basic challenges that need to be addressed.
And it highlights that interconnectedness. We were talking about safe drinking water, sanitation, hygiene. These are all linked. Improving one can have a positive impact on the others.
So it's not just about building more toilets, it's about creating a whole system that takes care of every aspect of sanitation, from the infrastructure to education to how waste is managed.
You got it. And there are some really inspiring examples of organizations working to improve sanitation in India, like Sulabh. They've been doing fantastic work for decades, building community toilet blocks and household toilets, particularly in low-income areas.
It's encouraging to hear, but it also shows that we need a multi-pronged approach, right? Government initiatives, NGOs, community-driven solutions, all working together.
Exactly. It has to be a collective effort. And that brings us to the role of citizens in all of this.
Right, because it's easy to feel overwhelmed by these problems and think that there's nothing one person can do, but you're saying that's not true.
Not at all. Citizen engagement is so important. It can take many forms, from advocating for better policies to supporting organizations to making changes in our own lives.
So things like conserving water and electricity, using public transport, being aware of the challenges and talking about them with others.
Exactly. Every little bit makes a difference. Remember, we're all interconnected. Our choices, our actions, they all have an impact.
It's a good reminder that we're not just passive bystanders. We can actually shape the city we live in.
Absolutely. And that brings us to our final thought for today. As we've explored the complexities of public facilities in India with a special focus on water in Chennai, It's become clear that access to these services, it's not just about convenience, it's about fundamental rights, human dignity, the opportunity to live a healthy and fulfilling life.
And it's not about finding easy answers. It's about understanding how these challenges are connected and taking a holistic approach. Combining infrastructure improvements with policy changes, with new technologies, and maybe most importantly, a change in how we think and how we consume.
So we leave you with this question: what role can you play in creating a more sustainable and equitable future for Chennai? It begins with awareness, it grows with action, and it flourishes with a shared commitment to ensuring that everyone has the opportunity to thrive. Remember, access to public facilities, it's a right, not a privilege.